everyone, today's teaching assistant is Molly. She's not a huge fan of being recorded or being on camera, so she's going to run away as soon as I let her go. But I just wanted her to say hi to you. Bye, Molly. Be free. Today we're going to talk about the case context. So the assessment tools and techniques we use in our practice to understand what the case context is. So we're going to look at the role of assessment in understanding the case context and the types of assessment available. If you'll remember from last week, case context is one of the 4 components of evidence-based practice. Case context involves an assessment of the case factors and information regarding the family through asking questions to obtain basically a history of the child or family to ascertain their current strengths and needs. So social workers practice in varied and diverse settings, including family agencies, hospitals, prisons, schools, etc. And regardless of that practice setting, we're engaged in the helping process with individuals and their families. In most cases, we have to assess the situation, resources, and support work, and negotiate a plan of action or therapeutic contract, and offer support in implementing this plan. Of course, this all depends on the agency context that you're working on, but in general, there's a personal and political tuning in, so an approach for developing preparatory empathy. In other words, a preparation process by which the social worker gets in touch with any personal biases, feelings, and concerns they might have about the type of person or client they're working with and their problem situation. So you have to understand it and acknowledge an individual's experiences as they relate to ethnic, cultural background and customs, as well as their geographical setting and the person's overall economic position in society. You can't make assumptions based on your own positionality. You need to understand theirs. So why do we assess? For one thing, it helps us develop the therapeutic relationship. It helps us in our clinical decision making and treatment planning and in selecting which intervention will be most appropriate. And lastly, it helps us monitor the situation and determine whether our current treatment plan is having the desired effect. All social work helping takes place in the context of this therapeutic relationship or helping relationship between the social worker and the client. As a result, it's really important to develop a positive relationship right from the onset of meeting with the client. And that involves authenticity, being a real person for the client, not just a faceless cog in the social service wheel. And remembering at all times that the client-worker relationship is unequal, especially in situations such as prisons, schools, and children's services. The worker has a lot more power than the client, and therefore that can really impact how well a positive relationship can be built. It's still very much possible. It just takes a lot more work for you to show to the family that yes, you are here for them, for their best interest, and that you're willing to work with them, not against them, in order to achieve their goals. So in order to start off on a positive note with the client, the first contact is the most important. During this first contact, you're going to inform them about the services provided by the agency, and you're going to clarify the agency's obligation or mandate. So suppose you're a child protection worker, you will clarify why you're there specifically within this home and what the concerns are regarding the family that have resulted in you being within that home. Next, you're going to explain to the client their relationship with the agency. So is this relationship mandatory? So do they not have a choice basically to be within this relationship? Or can they stop services at any time? You're going to then talk about what hours you're going to be available and the relevant policies that impact how you can communicate with the client, as well as the client's rights and entitlements. Usually this involves the rights to confidentiality, and the right to determine who has access to their case notes. You'll also explain to them the limits to confidentiality, which at this point I hope you all know by heart. The limits are that in the event they disclose the potential harm to themselves or another person, current child abuse, or you were ever subpoenaed to release your case notes within a court setting, they are entitled to confidentiality by you and the agency. Next, you're going to explain how you keep records. Is it case notes? Is it recordings? And you're going to be very careful not to use jargon or very specific terminology without explaining it. So don't assume that they know what CBP is. Explain the acronym and explain exactly what that therapy means and how it works. This will ensure that you are sharing your knowledge and power with the client in trying to even out that unequal relationship. So the initial assessment can take place on the phone, face-to-face, during a scheduled appointment, or during a crisis situation. The purpose is to become familiar with the situation facing the person or family and initiate the problem-solving process. Depending on the situation, it can take anywhere from 15 minutes to more than 1 hour. The process will vary depending on the practice setting and whether the social worker is meeting with one person, a couple, or a family, but it will usually be guided by agency requirements, which we'll look at in one second. So most of your agencies have a required format for documenting that original assessment through the gathering of demographic data and assessing the presenting concerns. For example, this will cover the presenting concerns brought forward by the family or by whoever referred the family's current support network, the immigration and refugee condition that is impacting them, their migration experience, or their status, if there's any issues there that might be causing stress to the family. You'll look at what their current employment situation is and what their educational background is, and this is very important because it can help you understand where they're starting at and what type of language you can use. In general, though, you should aim for a grade 5 to 6 vocabulary when working with families. You also want to talk about their housing or living arrangements to check for things like precarious housing issues or difficulty paying rent, and ask them about the general physical and emotional health because even if they're not there necessarily for assistance with their physical or emotional health, you are in the position to refer them to needed resources if they're there. And you also want to find out their history with social worker counseling services to find out if you're starting from scratch or if they already are familiar with the process. And you also really want to find out the role of religious beliefs and spirituality and how that plays into their lives. For some people, it's very important. It needs to be incorporated into their treatment plan. For others, it's a lot less important and not to ignore it, but it doesn't have to take a central focus within this treatment plan. And lastly, you're going to want to summarize everything at the end of the session with the client to ensure that you understood what they were saying and that your assessment is correct. So there's 3 types of assessments that we're going to talk about. There's qualitative, quantitative, and mixed. The qualitative assessment might be the one that you're most familiar with. This is based on a narrative or interview style, where you just engage in ethnographic interviewing, or rather a narrative approach, such as a process recording, or ask the participant just to describe their observations and explain their own situation in their own words. The qualitative assessment really adds depth to quantitative assessment. It is able to be a lot more culturally applicable than the quantitative assessment, and it can really help to build that engagement and alliance. It can help families and clients feel heard during the assessment process and not like they're just tick boxes on a page. However, that doesn't mean that the qualitative assessment is perfect. Consider what are some of the strengths and limitations of a qualitative assessment. For one thing, you might not get all the information that you need to know by just listening to the client's narrative, because they might not necessarily know all the things that they should be telling you in order for you to get a complete picture of the case situation. Next, we've got the quantitative assessment. So oftentimes, these are validated scales or instruments designed to give us a numerical representations of problems or strengths. For instance, there's the ASQ, or the Ages and Stages questionnaire, which gives you an indication of a child's development. Are they developing normally, above their age group, or are there any delays and their development has been slowed down? Another example is the Beck Depression Inventory. It can be used to make a clinical diagnosis of depression. And these can be administered by individuals. They can be done by the client by themselves, or they can be administered by the social worker. The purpose of the quantitative assessments is to understand exactly where a client is in terms of the issue that they're seeking assistance for, and it allows us to monitor any movement. Suppose a child measures on the ASQ as being developmentally delayed. Once we implement some play therapy designed to increase their fine motor movement, we can then measure to see if there's any improvement in their development. And this ensures that we're being held accountable for our treatments, that we can actually say to families, yes, we're seeing an improvement because of what we're doing here. And as with the qualitative assessments, quantitative assessments also have their own strengths and limitations. For one thing, many of the current quantitative assessments that we use have not been validated with all cultural groups, and they have been developed and tested primarily on white middle-class populations. Most of them were developed on students such as yourselves in universities, and then used within the wider world, sometimes without actually making sure that what works on the white college students will also work on an African Caribbean single mother with just a middle school education. So there are a lot of assessment techniques and tools that we can use that are more along the line of mixed methods. They take components of qualitative as well as quantitative assessments. The one that you might be most familiar with is the genogram or family tree, where the family and the relationship between family members is shown in something similar to this. There's also the eco map, which shows more of the relationship strengths between the client and all of the support systems that they have, including organizations. So what's blocked by my video is the fact that Sally is also very much involved with the church and a volunteer group. Next, we've also got social network maps. With these, you can find areas of potential support for clients. So if they're linked to someone, for instance, within this orange category, who then volunteers at a certain agency, they can use that relationship to increase their social support network. Or they might know somebody who is searching for employment opportunities in the red group, and they can connect that way. And then next we've got the lifeline, which is basically looking over the course of the entire lifespan of the client, notable positive and negative events, and why these events were positive or negative, to sort of learn how which events we can aim for in the future. For instance, one example here is that they really liked one of their previous jobs where they worked with people, as opposed to an advertising job where they were very unhappy and highly stressed. There's also more concrete things like a contract between the client and the social worker, wherein you lay out the specific goals that the client wishes to obtain and what they can do to work towards those goals. And there's many, many others. As part of this week's lecture video, I want you to watch a couple of YouTube videos. The first is on the assessment process by Dr. Beverly Ford. She does a much better job of explaining it than I ever could. The second video is also by Dr. Beverly Ford, and it looks at how you ask questions and the use of strengths-based language in the interviews. So in summary, assessments are a key part of the social work in any area of practice in developing that case context. They support a strong therapeutic relationship if done correctly and generate an effective service plan. There's also different types of assessments, each with their strengths and limitations. So you need to consider how you can address the limitations of the assessments currently used within your agencies by maybe relying on some alternative strategies in conjunction with the currently used assessments.